Hey everybody, Danielle Hargenrader here, and welcome to another episode of Unleash Your Inner Diabetes Dominator. Today I'm really excited to bring you an excellent guest who I'm actually probably going to butcher her last name, so she can correct me. Dr. Karin Hehenberger, am I saying that right?
That's almost correct. Hillenberger. Yeah.
Okay, great. She is the founder of LifeBulb. She was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at an early age, and she has dedicated her life to helping others impacted by chronic illness. Her personal history with diabetes, as well as its consequences, which required kidney and pancreas transplants, provide Karin with an understanding from a patient perspective as well as a medical professional. It is from those experiences, both as a patient and as a doctor, that Karin was motivated to create LifeBulb. So Karin, thank you for joining us today. How are you?
I'm doing very well, and thank you so much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So, as we normally do here on Unleash Your Inner Diabetes Dominator, we would love to hear about your diagnosis story. And obviously, you have a very interesting path that you've traveled from then till now, including the transplant. So, kind of give us a rundown of your experience with that.
So I was diagnosed when I was 16 years old. I grew up in Sweden, and I was very, very active. I was playing tennis at the time on the Swedish national tennis team. So I was playing tennis maybe four hours a day. But the spring before I was diagnosed, I had tonsillitis 3 times. So 3 bouts of infection. And obviously that was probably a trigger, or it could be that my system was already beginning to get very weak. I'm losing the picture of you. I'm not sure that is correct.
That's okay.
Yeah. Oh, there we go.
Yeah,
okay.
So don't worry about me. This is recording you as you talk.
I'll just
no worries.
Okay. Tell me if something goes wrong, because I will just talk then. Anyway, so when I was 16 and I was playing tennis, and that spring in school, I started really losing weight. And it was, when you're a teenager and you're a girl, I didn't really think about it much. I just thought it was actually quite nice. And in the beginning, it was just very little. But over the next few weeks and probably over a period of maybe a month, I lost a tremendous amount of weight, and I got much more tired. But during that time, I was still playing tennis really actively. And every summer in Sweden, there's a very big tournament in the south of Sweden where most of the junior tennis players go to play. It's like the Swedish national championship. And I was entering this tournament, and I every much more tired than I had been in the past, but I was still doing very well. I was pushing myself, but I was drinking constantly. I would go up I would have to leave the tennis court to go to the bathroom. In the middle of the night, I was both drinking and going to the bathroom. So very disturbing symptoms that actually no one in my family recognized.
Wow.
My parents were very scientific, but not on the medical side. My father is a quantum chemist, and he probably thought there was something weird going on, but they didn't really know what it was. So I just continued with what I was doing, and finally, after the tournament was over, and I actually went all the way to the final, which was remarkable because I had these cramps. I was so dehydrated, and didn't feel very good at all. And my parents then finally said, you need some rest. So instead of staying down in the south of Sweden and continuing to do another tournament, they just said, why don't you just go back up north and stay with your grandparents for a week and just completely rest. So my younger sister and I, we traveled up, and the grandparents, and with them, grandparents said, you probably have diabetes. I mean, they were more, I guess, experienced, and I didn't believe it. Of course, I didn't even. My experience with diabetes to that point was I knew one person with type 1 diabetes, and she was kind of a distant friend, and all I knew was that she was extremely thin. She was always mixing, her food, being very particular with it, and I could see how she would be injecting, and it was a very disturbing experience seeing her do all that. And I thought, I cannot be like her. That's not me. Nothing wrong with her. It was just that she was very different than anyone else I knew. but I realized something was wrong. I mean, at that time when I was up with my grandparents, I remember all I could think about was to go into there's a lake by their house to go swimming, because I just wanted to be close to water. It was remarkable how I was so dehydrated that I even craved swimming, which was not really my sport. I didn't enjoy it that much. I just wanted to be in the water. And again, drinking, and so on. And so my grandparents took me to their local little place, not even a hospital, to check out my blood sugar. And they didn't even check the blood sugar first. They just did a urine sample, and it was obviously sky high and with ketone bodies. So they took the next step and did a finger prick. And it was unmeasurable at the time. It was just, you know, at that time, this was 1989. They didn't even have automatic or these kind of automatic blood sugar readers. They just had the ones you compare the color on the little jar. The place where the nurse was checking me out, she said, "Oh yeah, you're very high. You got to go directly to the hospital." So again, I didn't believe it. I really didn't believe it. But we went with, you know, my grandfather driving very fast in the car over to the hospital, which was about an hour away from this country place. And we got there, and they immediately said, you know, you have type 1 diabetes. We need to put you on insulin. And the first thing, the one thing I remember, and I still remember it, it was a nurse, because they hospitalized me because I needed IV insulin, and I was, you know, at ketoacidosis. So they put me in a hospital bed, and while I was getting undressed, now that the nurse said to me, "You were so lucky, because if this had happened 70 years ago, you would be dead now."
Yeah.
And you know what? At that point, it was the first time ever in my life that I passed out. I just passed out. Wow. So I wake up, you know, on that floor with the IV not yet in, and I'm thinking, okay, so I would have been dead without this IV that they need to put in my vein and give me insulin for the rest of my life. I am completely, you know, my life is over. That's how I felt. Sure. Because I was, to that point, I was this kind of person who was completely, you know, very strong, strong athlete, strong in school, you know, happy family, very, everything was fine. And more importantly, much of what made me happy and what I was, I guess, what I felt that I was assessed by, which is my own fault, not my family's, but I was constantly thinking that I need to perform to be loved or to be liked, and so on. So I felt, okay, now I have the ultimate defeat, which is I have this disease that is going to kill me if I don't take the insulin. And what if the insulin is not around? You know, then I'm going to be, what if I want to go for a long walk and I don't have my insulin? All these thoughts came into my head. And I think the nurse, that comment that she made was so bad. It was the shock of a young person who, for every young person, I think when you're a teenager, you feel that you're invincible. I mean, this is the stage when you're starting to realize your parents are not gods. Your parents are not going to be able to answer all your questions. But for me, it was a catastrophic, you know, change in how I saw myself as someone who was not going to be the #1 tennis player in the world, not the one winning the Nobel Prize. You know, at that point, I was very arrogant, and it shut me down. Right. So for the next 3 days, I was in the hospital, and they taught me how to inject insulin. And I still also remember how my parents drove up, because they were still in Stockholm at the time, and they of course got the call from my grandparents saying that Karin is in the hospital, she has type 1 diabetes, and you better come here. And obviously they came immediately, and I could see my father first walking in, very serious, and my mother kind of behind with tears, just crying, and my reaction was, okay, I've disappointed them completely, because now I'm no longer the star. You know, I'm no longer this person who can do all the things that they want me to do. And that's obviously not how they saw it, but is my own perception. And so I think what was also important, what happened after that. So I made a few decisions when I was there. You know, I made a decision. I'm not going to focus only on my tennis. I'm going to become a medical doctor. I'm going to find a cure for this disease. I'm going to learn everything I know about it, but I don't have it. You know,
wow.
It was very distinct. It was, okay, I understand this is a problem and we need to solve it, but it's not my problem. And I even remember thinking about my pancreas and saying, the pancreas can't be failing me. I mean, why would it be failing me? I didn't do anything wrong. So it continued like that. And the other decision I made was that I was not going to tell anyone about this. You know, I told my parents, I told I had two younger sisters, one sister who's now working with me actually at Lifebulb. And at the time she was only 5. She was 5 years old. And my other sister was 13. And I told them, you cannot tell your friends about this. This is our secret. You know, no one knows about it. And they, I think because I was so strong about it, they kept to it. They didn't tell anyone. And what also happened, I think, which also affected the future for me in a bad way, but I mean good and bad way, was that my family had already planned that summer to move to Paris because my father had a work transfer, or with his job, he was going to move to Paris, and the whole family moved. So we moved from Stockholm to Paris the summer of '89, and I was going to start in a new school. And I thought that was great because I'm starting a new school. No one would have heard even a rumor of this, and no one needs to know.
Wow.
So in the fall, this was actually 3 days before my birthday, this happened in July 4th, '89. And then in August, we moved to Paris. So I had 1 month really to get somewhat educated in how to deal with diabetes before we were moving to Paris. And I had to get to a new hospital, a new doctor, and start a new school. Right. So there were many changes in a very short period of time. And the one thing I did very well, and my family did very well, especially my father, was to read everything we could about diabetes, about diet, about exercise, about how to deal with it. And then to try to get me on that program, and the entire family actually. My family really changed our diet and tried to become much more. I would say we've always been healthy, but we removed all, Coca-Cola, ice cream, that kind of thing that would be temptations for me. They just removed it. Wow. And for the 5-year-old, my little sister, I mean, she says to me now, she says, at that time, she realized that she could not eat that anymore because that would be something that would be offensive to me. And obviously when she was with her friends or when I was not around, she did. But out of respect for me, the family changed. And I think that put a lot of burden on me because over the years, I could hear, especially my mother, who is a fantastic chef. She's a very good cook, not a chef, but a cook at home. And she would say, when she was in a bad mood, she'd say, oh, Karin ruined the holidays. Karin ruined the meals because of her diabetes. We can no longer have these great meals. And that was not a good thing for me to hear because, it's not really my fault I have type 1 diabetes, but the entire family now has to eat healthy. So I guess my reaction, it was pretty dramatic, the diagnosis. It was classic. I mean, if you look at it from a medical perspective, it was very classic diagnosis, type 1 diabetes, no insulin, and immediately needed insulin injections. But I think what was different was that I didn't have that time to really get settled in and be in an environment that I knew. It was a lot of novelty when I started school then in the fall.
So yeah, so I want to interject here because you've said so many really important things in that story. First, I just want to say, as we talked about before, I don't know if you have a webcam that you can tilt down or a screen down, but your face is so beautiful, and I want everybody to be able to see your beautiful face. So yeah, because there we go. So guys, I always say this is a real show. We're not, this is live. We're not doing this. So maybe tilt it up just like about an inch. And then we can see. There we go. Perfect. Okay, perfect. So what you mentioned there, I want to touch on a couple things, was that you, in your immediate reaction of your diagnosis, felt that you were a disappointment to your parents. And I think a lot of people experience not only that they are disappointing their family, but they're a disappointment in general. I'm broken. That's the thing. I'm broken. even though inherently we know that it's not our fault that we're broken. There's nothing that we could have necessarily done to have not had it not happen, but that feeling is there. And from the other part that you were saying, that your parents decided that they wanted to support you and change their eating habits, which again was their choice. And I've interviewed many people and had the opportunity to speak to many people in the diabetes community about their experiences, and many people's families do not do that. They will continue to eat the way that they were eating before and hope that the person with diabetes is going to be able to abstain from eating the unhealthy foods and things like that. But then you have the other psychological aspect of you hearing your mother say that you ruined the holidays, when in reality, she chose to do that. So there's so much, because I deal with a lot of psychological, emotional aspects of living with diabetes with clients and things like that. And this is just so, the way you told that story, so I feel like so many people were probably like, I felt that exact same way. And so the way that you had to have that immediate switch from you're here in one place where you're used to living to another country, in a month, and the fact that you wanted to hide it. So were you able to hide it in school? And was that something that was there a time from then? Obviously now you're very open about it, but when did you decide that it was no longer a shame and that you shouldn't have to hide it?
It took a long time. I mean, it really took a long time. In high school, when in Paris, no one knew I had it. I think my parents actually told the principal of the school, because they felt an obligation that if I go low, that the teachers should know. I actually don't think all teachers knew, but they did tell the principal, and I didn't tell any of my friends. No one knew, and because I was in the so-called honeymoon during this period as well, I wasn't really requiring that much insulin. I mean, I was, type 1, very insulin sensitive, an athlete at the time as well, especially in the beginning. I was still very insulin sensitive, that I required long-acting insulin. I required insulin in the morning. I required insulin in the evening, but I didn't need to take insulin for lunch for the first year of diabetes, which is quite common. And also lunch in Paris, in that school where it wasn't like lunch in Sweden. In Sweden, a lunch is a very big meal. You sit down, you have a cooked meal. But in Paris, it was more like you have a yogurt, or you have something small, a salad. You get something very simple, and therefore I didn't really require much insulin during the day, which made it easier for me to hide it. I didn't have to test my blood sugar. I didn't have to go away and do anything. So no one knew I had it. For the 2 years that I spent in Paris, 11th and 12th grade, very few people knew I had it. It's actually just my family. And after that, I moved back to Sweden by myself, which again, I think, if I think about it from now, I would say my parents were so confident in me, and they probably were afraid of me because I was so strong that they wouldn't say no to me. And I said, okay, I'm finishing 12th grade, and now I'm going to go to medical school. I'm going to solve this problem. And I worked really hard to do that. And when I got in and I moved, they were still in Paris. And if you think about it, I had only had diabetes for 2 years. I was in this most vulnerable phase, as I see it now when I've looked at this. The person moving away from home and being a teenager still, it's very vulnerable. So anyway, so I moved back to Sweden. So I was now in Sweden. They were still in Paris, and I was alone. And I started medical school, which is a lot of pressure. And I still didn't tell anyone. And during that time, my honeymoon period was really over, so I needed to take insulin during lunch. So there were several occasions in medical school that I remember where I went low because I was very brittle. Throughout my time with diabetes, I was brittle. I could take 2 units and it could push me very low. Probably also because I was very low in my carb intake, and my body weight was always low. So for me to take a little bit of insulin, I could easily, and actually it goes to the point of, now I'm associating, which I do all the time, but a person with type 1 diabetes injects insulin in the subcutaneous tissue. And a person without diabetes has a pancreas that secretes insulin through the liver. And the longer you have type 1 diabetes, the less glycogen you build up in your liver. So a person like me who is light and also is not eating a lot of carbs has very little reserve as a type 1 diabetic. So for me, when I was going low, I couldn't mobilize my glycogen from my liver very easily. So that meant that in medical school, I would many times run, to the bathroom and, shove down something that I would eat. Sure. Because I was low and I didn't want to tell anyone I had diabetes. It went so far, 5 years later, 6 years later, in 1997, I graduated from medical school and I did my PhD in diabetes. And I defended my thesis in diabetes to 100 people. No one knew who had diabetes.
Oh my goodness.
And this was at the Karolinska Institute, which is, a great place. And that had to be standing there in front of these people who are all diabetologists.
I mean, the emotional, I can't even imagine. Now, obviously, you're an extraordinarily strong person. And there's nobody that can contest that, because the strength that it had to take, just purely emotional, for you to hide a part of you that obviously required a lot of thought cycles and a lot of mental involvement, but yet to keep that hidden away from giving your medical thesis, your doctoral thesis. I mean, that's overwhelming for me to even think about, let alone having to live through. So I mean, I can't even imagine that.
And I think that messed up my head somewhat.
Yeah, I could see that doing that.
No, because it really made me feel more flawed, because that part of me, which was constantly hidden, it was like a dirty secret that I couldn't tell anyone. And I did tell, when I had, a close friends that would deal with me, or a relationship, a romantic relationship, then I would tell. But then I would only tell the person and ask them not to tell anyone else. So I was very careful with it, and I was very angry if they were to leak it. So again, it was bad for me, because I think it affected me in my behavior. It affected me in my relationships, because it was this thing that was dirty, and obviously it affected me in how I used my own diagnosis in my work. Because I mean, what I'm doing right now is essentially saying, if we need to listen to patients, because only patients know how to deal with the disease. I mean, if you're sitting as a medical doctor and you're dealing with diabetes patients, if you're sitting as a Novo Nordisk or a Sanofi or a big company in diabetes, and you don't know what it's like living with the disease, you're ignorant. I mean, you're not ignorant. You know so much about the science, but you need to incorporate that in your strategy.
There's a massive difference between the science and the lived experience. They're not even in the same plane.
Right.
So I totally agree with what you're saying. But what I really want to know, and I'm sure people that are watching are going to want to know, is that when did you make the switch? Because it
was not voluntarily.
Monumental.
It was not voluntarily. So it went further, because after I graduated from Karolinska in Stockholm, I moved to the US to do my postdoc at the Joslin, the center in the world for diabetes. And every day I would go to the lab, which is the 7th floor, or whatever, iPad, the floor, the clinics. So I was working in the Joslin as a lab person, as a postdoc, and I would never tell anyone that I had diabetes. So really weird. And then I went on to work on Wall Street, and I worked in industry for another 7 years. And then I moved back to Sweden to continue to work in finance. I worked in venture capital. But that's when it all changed, because this was now in 2007. So 2007, and that is 18 years after diagnosis, I started getting real symptoms and complications. And it was very sudden. I mean, I would say that I probably had ignored a lot of the signs, and my doctors, importantly, had completely dismissed my signs, because I was so tricky as a patient. I was so good. I would come into the doctor and I would start talking about novel treatments and diabetes. I would talk about, what is the latest, and they would love having me as a patient, but they would hardly even take my blood pressure.
Wow.
So, over time, I knew I was getting worse and worse, but I ignored it. So in 2007, after a transatlantic flight, I landed in Stockholm, and my feet, I couldn't fit my shoes. And I was perspiring. I mean, something was really wrong. So I went directly to the, not the emergency room, but I went to my medical doctor who I had, and my endocrinologist. And he said, you know, this is not good. We need to take blood tests. And a nurse measured my blood pressure, and it was 220 over 180. And I had massive proteinuria. I mean, it was massive proteinuria. They couldn't even understand how much protein in my urine. And so that combination, and in addition to that, my hemoglobin, not my hemoglobin A1C, but my regular hemoglobin was down to 6. So they immediately gave me a blood transfusion because I needed a blood transfusion. I was so low. And then they started figuring out, why am I in this condition? And they looked at non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. They thought I had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. They thought I had acute nephritis, some sort of strange autoimmune disease. They put me in the hospital. I was there for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, a very experienced older doctor said, she just has really mismanaged her diabetes. It is kidney complications. She has such kidney complications that her kidneys are no longer producing EPO, erythropoietin. So erythropoietin stimulates hemoglobin, and I didn't have enough kidney capacity to generate hemoglobin. So I was in terrible shape, and my blood pressure was so high because of my kidneys that they needed to put me on 5 different antihypertensives to keep it down, and the doses that were equivalent for a man, maybe 300 pounds. And here I am, you know, it was as a very different body mass. So after about a month of this, where I just could not, I had to drastically not work because it was dangerous for me to get a stroke with this blood pressure. I had a revelation that I needed to deal with my diabetes. I needed to be open with my diabetes, and I wanted to solve diabetes in a different way. I wasn't going to cure it because I'd already left academic research, and I wasn't going to work on Wall Street to kind of build companies and make money for myself, which was really what I've been doing for the past, 7 years. I was going to work in a company where I could use my own experience with diabetes and help others with the disease. So that was my commitment, and therefore I had to talk about it. So a big change between 89 and 2007. So 2007, when all this went down, and by the way, obviously with the kidneys failing like they did, the next thing to fail were the eyes. So when I got discharged from the hospital, I was home, and my mother had flown in from the US where she lived. I mean, my parents live in the US, and I was back in Sweden, and my father put her on a plane to say, you got to take care of your daughter. So my mother shows up, which I didn't like. She stayed with me. And one morning when I was kind of rehabbing from this horrible thing, and I wasn't allowed to get high stress because of my blood pressure, I was trying to read the paper and I couldn't read. And my eyes were completely blurred. So I go to the eye doctor very dramatically, and I have macular edema. So I have diabetic retinopathy so severely that I have macular edema, and now I needed laser therapy. So my eyes during this period in 2007 were lasered so much that if I go to an American doctor now, which I do, just recently, a month ago, I go regularly, I only have this much tissue, a very little tissue just around the macula, which means that I have to move my head a lot when I drive. I have to move my head a lot when I walk, because if I don't, I can't see in the peripheral part of the eye. However, I am, perfect acuity, and they saved my vision. If they had not burnt my eyes so much with the laser, I would have been blind. I would have been blind. And this is from a person who studied diabetes. I did my PhD in diabetes. I've committed my life to diabetes, and I failed so dramatically. I mean, I think there's a combination, of course, between a genetic predisposition. There was something in me that triggered microvascular failure very quickly, because it was 18 years after diagnosis, and my eyes and my kidneys were very, very, very poorly, were reacting very poorly. And that is a genetic predisposition. But of course, it was also the first 10 years with diabetes, I had perfect control. My A1C between 4 and 6, I was extremely strict. Then I moved to the US with my postdoc at the Joslin and then Wall Street and all that. Terrible control. I just decided from that point on that I was going to keep my blood sugar higher and I wouldn't have the lows.
Yeah.
Because I didn't want to risk the lows, because when I have a low, I have to step out. I have to make a point that I have some sort of issue.
Yeah.
And because my decision was not to tell anyone, I didn't want to be different, it was easier for me to stay higher all the time. I managed my diet extremely well, but I didn't manage my blood sugar control very well.
So yeah, just to say, you know, from what I'm getting, because I just like anybody watching, I'm learning a lot about Karin right now. You know, we've only talked maybe once or twice before this. So, but just from my life experience and what I'm getting from this, you know, probably the biggest message here is that, you know, you can ignore diabetes or do whatever you can do to hide its existence, but that's not going to stop it from being there. And you know, one of the messages that I spread all the time is the most important first step in gaining the optimal health that anybody would want to have is self-love. And people don't see the connection between the two. But I think your story is a shining example, because you saw the diabetes as a part of yourself that didn't deserve to be loved, that didn't deserve to be recognized, that didn't deserve to be acknowledged, that should have been brushed under the rug. But the thing about diabetes is that I'm a big proponent of saying it's part of us, whether we want it to be or not. Most of us don't want it to be, but it is, and you can't change that. So instead of dwelling on the fact that you can't change it, you try to work on embracing that part of yourself and loving it the way you would a partner in a relationship. Maybe, you know, instead of getting a divorce, you can't divorce diabetes. And that's the thing, is that when you try to sweep it away, the consequences later on down the road are much more damaging than actually having to deal with the acknowledging of it in the moment. And your story is just so compelling. It's just, I'm grateful that you're here sharing it with me and everybody that's watching, because it's so necessary. And all that you've had to go through, the kidney transplant, the pancreas transplant. But I really want to hear now, and what you're doing now, which is so important with LifeBulb. Tell us about LifeBulb and how that came to be, because obviously now you're very passionate about being vocal about having diabetes and helping other people living with diabetes and other chronic diseases to embrace instead of hide and not deal with their disease. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, thank you. And I think you hit it right on. And I would say that I never during those years thought that diabetes was part of me. It was never part of me. It was not something that I acknowledged as part of me. If someone asked me, I remember my driver's license. When I filled out the driver's license, I didn't tick off that I'm diabetic.
Wow.
I wasn't diabetic. So, you know, it's a lie. It's probably illegal. I corrected it since. But you know, it was that far that I would not acknowledge this defect as I saw it. But so you're absolutely right. LifeBulb came about because we saw, and it was not just me. It was myself and my two partners, Steven Squinto and Ricardo Braglia, who are great friends and wonderful executives in the pharmaceutical industry, and very passionate people as well, who both experienced in some ways patient interaction, either themselves or with close family, and also experienced my struggles to a large extent with me. So we decided we needed to create an organization that was patient-centric, and that was the goal is to improve the quality of life for people living with chronic disease, with a primary purpose being diabetes. So diabetes is our priority. And we really do that by embracing the patient, and not just embracing the patient, but actually bringing back accountability and responsibility to the patient. I had all the help I could have got, you know, during these years. There was nothing that I lacked when it comes to medical competence, when it comes to access to care.
within yourself that you needed.
I can't blame anyone. It was all about me. If I as soon as I started taking accountability, as far as I took responsibility for my own disease and use my disease in a way that actually is better for me, but also for others, that's how we are going to change this pandemic. And this pandemic is crippling our countries. Not only our country, not only Europe, but the developing world. It is a terrible, terrible disease. From a financial perspective, more than $200 billion each year in the US, much more than that worldwide, but also a crippling disease for the individual. And I've experienced it. I mean, I had a kidney transplant in 2009, exactly 20 years after my diagnosis, 2 years after it all started falling apart. And in 2010, I got a pancreas transplant. So, I've seen how it is to feel that your body is falling apart when you're in your 30s. I mean, it was terrible to feel that I was like a person maybe 50 years older. Mm-hmm. And that's what this disease is. This disease is an accelerated aging, and it destroys every cell in the body if you do not take care of it. Yeah. However, if you take care of it and if you use the disease in a way that you can actually live a better life than a person who doesn't have the disease, and you can do various different things as a patient, and that's what we try to do with LifeBulb. We try to partner with innovative companies. So we identify companies that have products or in development or already in existence that, first of all, are aligned with us in our mission to improve the quality of life. And also have something that actually will improve for people living with the disease. So we partner with them and help them in various different ways. We've created this event series, which is so far only in New York, but we hope to expand it geographically. We've done one event in Stockholm, but we've done 15 in New York, where we showcase companies that are aligned with our mission, but also raise awareness for specific conditions. And then thirdly, we're building this community and the community online, which is really growing, and we want to embrace everyone's stories, because we think everyone has a unique story, and we want to show how you as individuals deal with this disease, not only from diet, exercise, work, but also psychological perspective, because I think that is the biggest hindrance for a disease that never allows you to take a break. As you said, I mean, this is a disease that you cannot divorce. You cannot even take a vacation from. So it's a difficult one. And
you can't even be in a different room as it.
No, you cannot. You cannot. But I think it's important that we think about the different constituents here. We have the patients. We can do things. We can help each other. You and I have talked about a mentoring program. I think we need to absolutely launch that. Number two, patients. We have on our website something called Patient Entrepreneurs. You're one of them. We embrace all these patient entrepreneurs who have not only taken charge of their disease, but they've identified needs that they want to address, and they create products or solutions or companies that can address those problems for themselves and for others. That's the patient entrepreneurs. Patients can also educate their doctors. As we talked about, doctors need to be educated. They need to know what it's like living with the disease. Doctors are sitting and looking at blood levels. They get reports, but they don't feel the disease. I met with a young type 1 entrepreneur yesterday, a young man from Israel, fantastic, smart, wonderful guy. And he said, I went to Medtronic and I showed Medtronic my pump. And I said to them, have you ever slept with this pump? Have you ever gone to the beach with this pump? And the engineers at Medtronic, they may not have done that. Medtronic, to applaud them, I think, they hired Fran Kaufman, a fantastic lady who really knows what it's like to deal with diabetes. But we need to put more emphasis on doctors, on companies, to realize what it's like living with the disease, because only if we do that, we can change this. And then thirdly, society. Because right now, if you ask a person walking down the street in Manhattan, what is diabetes? They say it's a disease that, you blame the person almost for it. Oh, it's a person who's eating lots of McDonald's, drinking Coca-Cola, and is overweight. That's not the case. And also type 2 diabetes is a very difficult disease. Type 2 diabetes is highly genetic. A person with type 2 diabetes at the same weight as a person without type 2 diabetes, you don't need to have diabetes if you're at the same weight. So there's a genetic predisposition of developing type 2 diabetes. And type 1 diabetes is a completely different animal. It's an autoimmune disease that obviously there's no one that you cannot blame yourself for it. So we need to educate society. We need to make sure, because otherwise, when we compare diabetes to cancer, to HIV, to orphan disease, to multiple sclerosis, diabetes is not getting the same amount of attention, is not getting the same amount of money.
And we have way more people who are affected.
Way more people. We're not generating enough new patents, because young scientists are not going into diabetes. Young doctors are not going into diabetes because it's not paid. So we need to change the perception of the disease. We need to make diabetes cool. We need to make diabetes a disease that we want to go in and fix. Yeah. And the only people who can change that are the patients.
Are us. I agree. I couldn't agree. I'm so happy to have met you, because I feel so aligned to everything that you're saying. And just, to the fact that you're a doctor and you've experienced this, and you can just really speak from the lived experience, is just so, it's invaluable. And I mean, I always say this to people, but I mean, with you, I could sit here and talk to you about this endlessly, but I want to make sure that this is consumable by everybody who's watching. So let's go to, now that you're looking back on your life with diabetes and where you are now, what would you say are your top 3 tips for thriving with diabetes? And at this point, I think I brought up that one about the emotional side and accepting and embracing versus fighting and hiding. But for you, in your experience, what would you say that would be for Karin?
Yeah, for me, number 1 is education. I still think that knowing about the disease, knowing about what it is, knowing about what can happen, and not be afraid of looking at what could happen if it goes wrong. Really learning about the disease is number 1. Number 2 is taking responsibility, really saying that, okay, I need to get help. I need to get the right doctors. I need to get the right people around me, but I myself need to take responsibility for this disease. And number 3, I have to borrow yours, because I think it's really, really important, is to open up to be helped. Because if you are not allowing people in, if you're not sharing your story, if you're not sharing your experiences and actually allowing your weakness to be shown, it's going to be so tough to live with. It is impossible to deal with yourself. And what I've learned over time is that a person who never shows their vulnerability, I mean, I remember people would say, oh, she's like this ice queen. Mm-hmm. And I think that was, I'm blonde also. And I could see, that because I never showed vulnerability, because I hid my biggest secret. And because I hid my biggest secret, I was also very careful sharing other things. And it's not like I share everything now, but I do think that opening up to others will allow them to open up to you. And therefore, it's a much better interaction generally. But for the person living with diabetes, it is medically very important to do that as well. And it will allow the person with diabetes to live a life that is healthier.
Yeah, I agree. And in my book, I even write about it. I mean, what you just said is so incredibly true, is that we oftentimes as a society see being vulnerable as a weakness. But in reality, I believe with every fiber of my being that being willing to be vulnerable is one of the biggest strengths that any human being can have, because guess what? It's hard. And doing things that are hard make you strong. So being vulnerable and allowing that dialogue, allowing that healing, allowing that interaction to happen, that's not weakness. That's the ultimate strength. Asking for help is being strong, not being weak. And I am so adamant about reversing the way that we look at that, because as a community of people with diabetes, we often feel alone and we feel like we're a burden to other people. And we need the help, but we don't want to ask for the help because we feel like that's going to make us weak. What's making us weak is not asking for the help, because the help is not going to just fall into our laps. We need to open up and ask for it and be willing to accept it and realize and embrace that that's what strength actually is. So I'm all about that. And I feel like I'm a very strong person too. And I'll be the first person, if something's going on, I'll call my mom, I'll talk to my husband, I'll talk to my, one of my close friends in the diabetes community, because I want to get better. I don't want to sit here and stagnate in my misery. I want to, I'm going to be vulnerable. I might even cry. Guess what? I cry too, but that's how the healing happens and we get to move on and make progress. So Thank you. I mean, thank you so much for sharing your story. It honestly, not to be crazy, but it just makes me so excited, to see what LifeBulb is going to bring to the community and how it's going to grow, because I know it's still, just getting started. And I think it's just a resource that is incredibly important and is going to be so powerful as it grows. So thank you so much for joining us. And as I always do, I'm going to link LifeBulb's website here. Any other way that Karin wants you to find LifeBulb on Twitter, all that stuff, it's going to be linked below the video on YouTube and also below the video on my blog. So you can get in touch with LifeBulb and follow them there. And Karin, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much. Really, I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
Oh yeah, my pleasure. All right, guys. So that is it for now, and we will catch you on the next episode of Unleash Your Inner Diabetes Dominator. Take care.